Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our newsletter and our great sponsors, Your Dolce Vita, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abiativa Casa. And today I have a great returning guest, Joe Tucciarone, and he's the co-author of Italian Swindled to New York. And he's also got a new YouTube series, Italian American History. So welcome, Joe. Thanks for being here.
Bob, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here.
No, it's great stuff that you're putting out there. So what prompted you to start expanding now from the book out to doing some things on YouTube?
Actually, that started about a year and a half ago. I wanted to somehow commemorate a local event in my hometown. The first Italians in my hometown, and actually the first Italians who were permanent settlers in the Youngstown area. And I wanted to commemorate that because a year ago was the 150th anniversary of that event.
Wow. You know, that's hard to believe. A lot of people don't realize how long Italians have been here, and when they started coming and what they did when they got here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You know, most historians mention that the great mass migration of Italians began in 1880. And when they say that, in a way that's true, but unless you look at the details and the background and the context of world events, it's really not true. It started earlier than that if you do those studies.
Yeah, and you know, even as far back as Thomas Jefferson, he had an Italian confidant or friend or whatever you want to call him, right? With respect to the YouTubes, what significantly happened that you put in the YouTube video? And
I've got a half a dozen of them up there. Which one are you referring to now?
oh, the one that I wanted to talk about was the one about the railroads.
Okay, right. Okay. So yeah, that's one of my most recent. It's based on events that we uncovered in the book, the Italian Swindled to New York book. And I wanted to expand on that and find out, if I could, more information, because the publisher of our book said, look, we'll give you 50,000 words and that's it. You can't put any more in there. And so we had to limit everything we said to fit that guideline. And I knew there was a lot more to find about these Italians who came down to Virginia in 1872. So that was the impetus for that video.
Yeah, and that's something. And you know, so you learn something every time I talk to you or somebody else. I learned them. Who knew there were Italians in Virginia in 1872?
Right.
So they get to Virginia, and did they just start working on the railroad?
How about I give you just a little bit of background first?
Yeah, good.
These Italians who came to Virginia, the ones I describe in the video, they were part of the nearly 3,000 who were swindled to coming to the United States. They were dumped in New York City without friends or without jobs. And so they had nothing, no recourse, no money, no jobs to look forward to. And what happened was the superintendent of Castle Garden, Bernard Castlery, put out the word that I've got a lot of people looking for work. And it just so happened that the governor of Virginia was looking for men to come down to work there because Virginia had been decimated by the Civil War. They lost upwards of 30,000 working men. And so he needed help. He needed people to come down and work. Basically, he wanted farmers to come down and work the fields because there were a lot of farms that were fallow because of the soldiers who were killed there, the Confederate soldiers. And so Bernard Castlery found out about this, and they communicated. He and the governor of Virginia communicated about this, and 200 Italians were booked to Virginia. But kind of along the way, it was decided that instead of them being farmers, they would go to work in the city of Virginia to help in a railroad project. They were building a railroad tunnel under the city. They were doing that to avoid destroying historic landmarks. You know the Churchill area of Richmond. I think it's where isn't that where Patrick Henry gave his speech, "Give me liberty or give me death"?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know a heck of a lot about Virginia. I've driven through there, but
Yeah, I'm not real sure either, but I believe the Churchill uh, area was historically significant, and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad wanted to connect to the Tidewater so they could ship goods through to and from overseas. And the best passage was to go through Richmond. And unfortunately, the initial plan put that railroad right through Churchill. Well, they couldn't do that. They couldn't destroy this historic area, so they decided to build a tunnel under the city, and that's what they needed these Italians to come and do to help dig this tunnel.
that's just so interesting. To hear these stories and find out. And what year was that?
This was in December of 1872,
Wow.
long before the 1880 date that everyone thinks that Italians came to this country. This happened 8 years earlier than that.
So now did these men, I mean, were they the first of a larger group to go there? And did they settle there or did they move on from there?
There were already Italians living in Richmond at the time. I don't know how big the colony was, but they were established and they were well liked by the general populace. They had a beneficent society. They had a ball, I believe, a few months or a few weeks before these Italians from New York arrived. So they were kind of, accepted by society and moving in societal circles in Richmond.
I'm gonna show a little clip of that just to whet people's appetite, and so they could see what you have to offer in this particular video.
3 months after their arrival, opinions differed on the performance of the Italians. Some praised their efforts.
The Italians, now employed at the tunnel and on the terminus of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, are an industrious, frugal, and painstaking class of laborers. They mind their own business, work well, and promptly paid for what they get. We have room for more of them.
Yet others voiced disappointment.
One Virginia African is estimated to be worth 3 Roman citizens in that kind of work.
Now I know one of your I think this is the most recent one that you did was the whole Castle Garden to Liberty Island versus Ellis Island, right?
Yeah, the one we've just been talking about, the Italians coming to Richmond to help dig the tunnel and then to build the 2 railroad viaducts in the mountains. That's a sort of it's a nice feel-good story, but it's limited to a couple of hundred Italian immigrants. The one you just mentioned, the Castle Garden Ellis Island story, is really big. It's a national story, and let me tell you why. And I didn't know this until I started the research. In 1890, Congress had decided that Castle Garden was no longer adequate to handle the huge numbers of immigrants that were coming in to the country. They decided to open the first federal immigration bureau. See, up till that time, there had been an immigration bureau in New York City called Castle Garden, but it was a state-run entity. And it was located, as you probably know, on the tip of Manhattan Island. So when immigrants came off the boats, they were immediately surrounded by some undesirable elements, people trying to put them up in shabby boarding houses, sell them goods, all sorts of criminal activities. And so in 1890, the United States Congress decided we have to have a controlled environment to bring immigrants into this country. It has to be a federally operated environment. In fact, they stated that this cannot be entrusted to the states. And they were referring to the Castle Garden facility, which was operated by the state of New York. They put William Windom in charge of locating this new facility. Now, let me give you some background. In 1890, when this was all under discussion, The Statue of Liberty had already been standing on Bedloe's Island for 4 years. It had just arrived 4 years earlier. It seemed to take a little while, but America fell in love with the statue. They called it our beloved Lady Liberty. And it's located on an island, a limited access area. It's the kind of place that the U.S. Congress would have thought to build this immigration center. Think about it. In fact, William Wyndham said, it's quoted in my video, that this seems to be the best place to bring immigrants because as their ships come into the harbor, they'd be welcomed by the grand statue of Lady Liberty. What could be more fitting, he thought. So that's the background. Why then, as I ask at the beginning of the video, why then did they decide to put this new immigrant depot on Ellis Island instead of Bedloe's Island, where the Statue of Liberty was? That's the big question. And it's sad to say the answer lay in anti-Italian bias. Because what was happening in 1890 was the United States was seeing a huge surge in Italian immigration. At that time, immigration from Great Britain, Canada, Ireland, Germany, those had all been countries that had sent huge numbers of immigrants to this country in the 1860s and 1870s and early 1880s. But immigration from those countries, the four leading countries when it came to immigration into the United States, the immigration from those countries was declining. At the same time, immigration from Italy was beginning to skyrocket. And what was happening was a lot of those Italian immigrants were brought here by padrones. Those are the Italian bosses. And they were brought over in the thousands. And the padrones negotiated with railroad companies and coal mines to send hundreds of Italian laborers on each of these construction projects or mines. And they would come in and the padrones would offer the owners, I'll tell you what, my men will work for half of what your American laborers are working for. Well, American industry loved the sound of that. More background on this is that in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, America was in what was called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age referred to the huge expansion of the country westward, the huge increase in steel output. In other words, the country was really blossoming industrially, and it needed workers. It needed workers desperately in the last half of the 18th century. The padrones were able to furnish this. But, if you think about it in perspective, Americans didn't want this. Their husbands and sons were being displaced by these foreigners. It wasn't really the fault of the Italians. They were swindled over here continuously in the latter part of the 19th century by the padrones. And so they were brought in, they were forced basically to do what the padrones told them to do. So the fault lay in the padrones, but the fallout was that because America was being inundated by this class of Italian immigrants, Congress said basically, no. They said to the Treasury Secretary, no, we don't want you to build this immigrant depot on Lady Liberty's Island because it will desecrate her. You have to find a different place. At the time, Ellis Island could not be approached by large boats because it had shallow waters. It was occupied by a naval munitions depot. So there were no good reasons to put the immigrant depot on Ellis Island, but Congress insisted that Wyndham do so. And so that's why Ellis Island and not Liberty Island was the site of the great immigration center that we all know so well. We call it Ellis Island.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, and you can look at that story and almost compare it to what's going on now. You know, so many people are coming. It's not their fault.
Right.
They're being invited in, but you know, instead of padrones, now you have these cartels making tons. And I mean, the money they're making probably pales in comparison to what these padrones were making back then.
Right. It's an interesting story, and for us, it's a sort of sad story. But uh, you have to look at history dispassionately. You have to realize it can't always be a happy ending. It can't always be good. And so, because of anti-Italian bias in Congress, Ellis Island became the center of immigration instead of Liberty Island.
Yeah, and I didn't know it. That it was because of the Italian. You know, you watch some of these documentaries on Ellis Island, and you see the things like the one that stands out to me was that I don't remember the doctor's name, but he was the one who apparently uh he had drawings or pictures of people, and then hung. You know, if you look like this, you're an imbecile. If you look like this, you're an idiot. You know, that kind of stuff. And most of the pictures look like Italians.
The newspaper articles of that time, the contemporary articles, they always, not always, but they tended to illustrate Italian immigrants in a derogatory way. They depicted them as what are called banditti or brigands instead of the ordinary run-of-the-mill immigrants that they were.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of that we just watched a couple of weeks ago. We watched Cabrini, which I found was really fascinating. I mean, first of all, the woman herself was just unbelievable. But you really got that sense of how bad the 5 points were. And of course, the Irish were there before, the Irish gangs were there before, but then you could see, and again, it almost parallels what's going on today in some of these immigrant neighborhoods where their own people are taking advantage of them. It's really terrible stuff as human beings, how that happens, you know?
Right. Yeah. What you just mentioned, the Cabrini movie. Uh, I've seen a lot of movies, and I know how Hollywood dramatizes things. The part about that movie where the Italians were spit upon and that was real. That's not a Hollywood invention. I have collected I don't know how many documents, hundreds of documents, and in those documents, it clearly shows that there was anti-Italian bias, a strong anti-Italian bias in the 1880s and 1890s, and they were treated like that. In fact, I've got one article from New York City. I think it was in 1873. This was one of those first Italians who had been swindled over here. They began working in the city, and a number of them got on a streetcar, and the conductor ordered them off the streetcar. This is the kind of thing you see in 1950s in the South. You know, they told the blacks to go to the back of the bus. Well, they ejected the Italians off this streetcar in 1872. So,
yeah, well, they show that they show that in the movie, and I found, I don't know where I found it, but I found an article someplace where they did a comparison of the movie to real life, and it was, you know, to your point, it was almost 90% accurate. The things that were going on.
right.
You know, they said, like, the mayor, for example, he wasn't the real mayor, and they said in some cases they like they usually do in Hollywood, they'll make one character out of three or something like that. But the scenes of 5 points and you know, how she was treated both in Italy and in America were pretty true. But I just came away from, I mean, I remember hearing about Mother Cabrini you know, in grammar school, because, you know, she was made a saint not shortly before I was in school. But they didn't go into a lot of detail, you know, the first American saint, and we were Italian, so of course that matched up. But I had no idea what a strong will this woman had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually had never heard of her until a friend of mine mentioned the movie to me a couple of weeks ago.
Really? Yeah. I remember because I mean, I didn't grow up in an Italian neighborhood, but there were a lot of Italians there. But I I remember them talking about it because I don't know if there was an earlier movie or maybe they were celebrating the 10th or 20th anniversary of her being a saint or something like that. But it was always out there that she was, of course, the first American saint. So I do remember that.
In the 1880s, Padrones brought thousands of Italians to the United States. During that time, attitudes toward the newcomers hardened as they displaced American workers. When the Secretary of the Treasury, William Windom, suggested landing migrants on Liberty Island, indignant citizens and a galvanized Congress opposed him. As a result, the nation's storied immigration center would rise on Ellis Island, and a half-mile of open water would keep the lowly foreigners from Bartoldi's famous sculpture. The unrestrained importation of Italian immigrants by Padrones had determined, in large part, the site of America's historic gateway.
So Joe, so you mentioned that you started this about a year and a half ago. What are some of the other topics that you cover in the YouTube videos?
So far, the videos cover things that I've unearthed over the last dozen years, and a lot of which appeared in my books. One of the things that I'm very, I don't know how to say this because it's a very sad event what happened, but I'm very proud of having worked on this project. When those Italians came to my hometown in 1873, 150 years ago, there was also a group of them who went to a town right next door, just walking distance away from my hometown. And what happened there was worse than what happened in my hometown. What happened there is the Italians were being harassed by the locals. The Italians came in and took the jobs that the locals had quit. The locals went on strike. These were in the coal mines of my area. The local miners went on strike. The owners went to New York City, brought these Italians in. The Italians had no idea they were being brought in as strike breakers. They didn't know until they got there. But they were poor. They couldn't return to New York City, so they had to do what they had to do. They went into the mines. And so the miners, and this little village was called Church Hill, by the way. It had nothing to do with Church Hill in Richmond, Virginia. Church Hill, Ohio was a small mining village, and the Italians there were harassed as they worked in the mines. The strike came to an end. Some of the miners who had walked off the job were told, "You're not welcome here." They were not welcome to come back to the mines. The Italians, some of them remained to work in the mines, and one of them was a 20-year-old named Giovanni Chiesa. And what happened was one day in July in 1873, he was down at the well getting water. And one of the local former miners insulted him, broke his bucket, told him to go back to Italy. And that's when Chiesa went back to his barracks, his shanty. He had 7 other Italians living there with him. And he said, "I'm sorry, I can't bring your water. I was attacked." And the Italian said, "We'll go without water today." A short while later, that man, his name was Trotter, William Trotter, came to the barracks, and he wanted to continue the fight. He had not had enough of it, and so he started a fight with Chiesa. The rest of the Italians joined in, and they injured Trotter. Well, Trotter left the village, heard about the fight. They heard about Trotter being injured. 200 locals showed up, surrounded the barracks, and attacked and burnt the place. And there was one German living with those 7 Italians. And the German was the first one to escape. The crowd didn't hurt him. They said, "You can go as long as you do not bring the police." So the German left. The Italians, one by one, left the burning building. They were beaten as they came out, severely beaten. One of them was beaten so bad he had to have a leg amputated. Another had 2 broken arms. So this was not just a few punches. They were beaten with clubs and stones. The last person out of the building was Giovanni Chiesa. And he was so badly beaten by the mob that he died that evening. And it turns out that as far as I can tell through my research, he was the first Italian to be lynched in this country. And you don't hear about that because, well, nobody cared about the Italians in those days. I did research to see when the first Italians were lynched in this country, and I found a book. I can't remember the name. I think it's called Rope, something with the name Rope in it. Anyway, the author of that book said that the first Italians lynched in the United States, that happened in 1886, she said. Well, my study showed 13 years earlier, Giovanni was lynched. Now, you might say, oh, doesn't the lynching involve a hanging? If you go to the NAACP website, a hanging, it could be a part of a lynching, but not necessarily, it does not necessarily define a lynching. If a person is severely beaten and is killed, that's a lynching in modern terminology.
Yeah, see, I didn't know that. You always associate with the lynching with being hung or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, it's important for us to get these stories out because it's part of our history. Like you said earlier, there's not always a happy ending to everything like that. I mean,
exactly.
we've certainly, come a long way, but as we spoke in one of the other videos that we did, now we've gotten this whole stereotypical kind of wise guy type of thing that's we're not like that. It's just almost a cartoon image sometimes of Italians. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times when I was younger, when people found out I was Italian, they asked me if I knew any mafia. I didn't know anybody in the mafia.
Well, I knew a couple, but I didn't know they were mafia back then. I didn't realize I didn't realize until I was about 16 or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to that point, you didn't know because they weren't flashy about it. That was
Right.
their job, I suppose. But they weren't like this stereotypical, wise guy walking, swaggering down the street with a cigar and all of that kind of stuff. You wouldn't know. You would never know that they were
Right.
associated
Yeah.
in gangs or something like that. And they didn't live flashy lives because they didn't want to be, out there. Of course, there was some like, Gotti and those guys, but
Al Capone for one.
yeah, there was, probably, I guess in every era there was that one guy who was very flashy, I suppose. Sure. But my father was a photographer for the Daily News in New York City for like 40 years, and the Gallo brothers, specifically Joey Gallo, he always wanted to be in the newspaper. And my father was always taking his pictures. And one day Joey was coming out of court and my father was there taking his picture. And some guy kept pushing the camera out of the way. And my father went over to Joey and said, "Hey, what's going on? I can't take a picture anymore." And Joey Gallo said, "He's being taken care of. Don't worry about it." The next week, they found the guy in the trunk of a car.
Oh, geez.
My father was like, "I hope it wasn't because I asked him about taking the pictures."
It's interesting that you mentioned the Gallo name. In some of my research, there were Padrones in New York City named Gallo. And one of them came before a congressional hearing in 1890, all about the Padrones.
Wow, so they were having hearings way back then.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And Gallo was subpoenaed to come and give testimony at this hearing about the Padrones in New York City. I think he was suspected of being one.
Wow, that's really something. I didn't know that. I didn't really know that. And that's the other thing, because we were talking about a couple of the movies, and the one was the one, I think was the name Petrosino, the New York City policeman. They made one movie about him. Ernest Borgnine played him, which I thought was a fascinating movie, but they don't talk a lot about the Italians that were actually fighting crime.
Right, right. He was highly regarded at a time when many Italians had to endure prejudice. his name is in newspaper articles, and he was always spoken of so highly in these articles. And one thing I found in my research that I had never seen before is that, and we have this in our Swindled book, he came with his father in 1872, in November 1872, to the United States. He was only 11 years old. And it turns out the ship he was on was one of those named by Congress as one of the swindle ships. And it was believed that most, if not all, of the Italians on that ship had been swindled to this country. So Giuseppe Petrosino and his father Prospero may well have been victims of their countrymen, their cheating countrymen, and they were brought here on false promises. And so to me, it's interesting that Joe Petrosino, who became such a well-known crime fighter, began his life in this country as a victim of a crime.
Well, I wonder, maybe that's why he was so adamant about going after, because if I remember correctly, he was like one of the first Italian American policemen, and then he started the Italian squad or something like that. If I'm getting the story right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and he wasn't looked at very nicely by the Irish police either. The other story that comes to mind was the story that I heard from somebody that lived in Brooklyn, and how his church was built. And his church was built because the Irish wouldn't let the Italians have mass in the church in Italian. So they went to the bishop, and they asked for to be able to build a church, and they wound up building the Italian church maybe 3 or 4 blocks away from the other church. And then to take it to the next step, which is really one of the most fascinating things I ever heard from anybody. They had a storefront. The church was in a storefront, and the priest couldn't pay the bill. He couldn't pay the $500. And he was walking past this Jewish store. The Jewish couple owned this store, and the guy said to him, "Father, why do you look so sad? What's wrong?" And he said, "Oh, I can't pay the bill. I can't pay for the church." And he said to him, and a young couple, and he said, "I'll pay it." And this Jewish man and his wife collected from Jewish families $500 and gave it to the priest so he could, pay the rent or whatever. This was 1913. In 1939, by this time, the husband had passed away. His family was writing letters from Austria to his wife saying, "We need to leave Austria because the Nazis are coming and we got to get out." She tried to get help from the government, the U.S. government. She couldn't get any help. And somebody told her to go to Cuba, that there was a priest in Cuba that might be able to help. She goes to Cuba. She gets off the plane, and she's greeted by an altar boy and the archbishop. The archbishop was the priest that she gave the $500 to. And he was the papal, whatever he was. He was very close to Pius XII. They got 39 of these, I think it was 39 or 36 people to Cuba. He supported them until the end of the war, fed them, clothed them, kept them.
That's great.
Amazing. People say, well, there's no God or whatever. Me personally, I'm on the fence, but when you hear a story like that, you say, geez, this can't be an accident.
Yeah, that's a good story.
A fantastic story. And it's, very well known in Brooklyn, very well known in Brooklyn. So before we go, Joe, where can people find the videos on YouTube so we get them to see them?
If you, I think that my moniker is Italian American History. And so that's how you would find my stuff. short of giving you the URL, which would be a ridiculous thing to do, that's how you find my stuff.
Yeah, and I'll for sure put the links out there and everything like that. Well, fascinating stuff, Joe. I really appreciate you taking the time. And if anybody's paying attention to Joe and I and Michael Cavieri, we're going to be working on a project together soon. We're in the planning stages right now.